Dr. Schulz, it's so wonderful to meet you and to have you on our podcast. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
So the topic that we're talking about is something that should be of interest to everyone. And you've been working in this field, and I think it's the most complicated of all human endeavors, the pursuit of happiness. And it's one that I personally had a very unusual experience of it. In 2002, I was at NIH doing research on neurodegenerative diseases. Lived in Bethesda, beautiful place, and then right afterwards, I was asked to go to Afghanistan by World Bank to do some assessment. I have some public health background, and it was so amazing to me that in this most educated of cities in the world, one of the most affluent cities, there was more depression than in the rural Afghanistan, where people were in pretty bad shape in 2002.
Definitely.
And that gives you a perspective of where happiness might be coming from. But I don't want to give it, expand beyond that. Before we go on, I want to kind of bring your background and the research you're doing and this population that you're working on. I want to let you kind of expand on that a little bit. Tell us a little bit about what you've been doing.
Sure. So I'm the associate director of a study that's called the Harvard Study of Adult Development. And it's really a remarkable study that started in the 1930s. And it started by following 724 adolescents. And these are adolescents from two very different walks of life. So almost 2/3 of the original participants were boys that were living in the poorest areas of Boston. They tended to live in tenement buildings without running water or toilets. And just down the block from those boys were another group that were studying at Harvard University. So these were Harvard students. It was about 1/3 of the sample. So a much more privileged and sort of optimistic outlook on life at that point. And the study has followed those two groups, 724 individuals altogether, through their entire life and followed them really closely. So we've interviewed them, we visited them in their homes when they were young, met their parents. We ask, of course, closed-ended traditional questions like all social scientists, but we also ask a lot of open-ended questions. And as I've said, we've interviewed them over the years as well. More recently, we've gone to visit their homes, observed them when they're talking to their loved ones, asked them about the relationships with their children who we're now studying. So we're studying the 1,300 daughters and sons of the original participants. So it's a remarkable study for how long it's lasted, the original diversity of the participants, and also the closeness with which we've followed them over the years.
Yeah.
Amazing.
The questionnaires that you use, what are the questionnaires and how often do you implement that? And all that would be and it would give us some insight.
Sure. So over the course of the 8 decades that we've followed these folks, on average, we've interviewed them every 5 to 10 years. We've sent them questionnaires to respond every 2 years or so. And the questionnaires, the times have changed and the science has changed over the years as well. So the questionnaires were the standard sort of psychological questions that were asked at the time, but they've evolved. So we asked about the quality of their relationships with others. We asked about how they coped with challenges in their lives. We asked about the source of those challenges in their lives. And we asked, especially, we were interested in what the lived experience was. So we tried to sort of get inside their head, if you will, and understand what it was like to live for them and what the challenges and opportunities were like. The questions have certainly changed over the years. So in the 1930s, they thought it might be worthwhile to measure the kind of physiognomy, the way the head was shaped, and that might predict certain things. And now we know that that's unlikely. And more recently, we've introduced sort of modern scientific methods like brain scanning and assays of blood to determine things like epigenetic expression of genes and things like that. So the questions have changed over the years, but one of the other unique things and important things about the study is from its very beginning, it was a study about thriving. It wasn't a traditional medical study about pathology or disorder. It was really about trying to understand the ingredients that helped humans thrive. And there were two very different groups of people, as I said, but they're both thriving in certain ways. So the poor boys growing up in these neighborhoods in Boston had thrived in the sense that they had stayed out of trouble, unlike a lot of their peers that were growing up in these tough neighborhoods. So at the beginning of adolescence, they were doing okay. And the kids that had gone to Harvard obviously were thriving in a different way. But the study really focused on the factors that led to, again, human thriving and happiness, what we call a good life. We have a new book coming out called The Good Life.
That's right. No, we want to highlight the book. I think it's a critical topic to at least get insights on. My question also is, did you collect any audio recordings? Did you collect any? Because to me, given our tools that we will have or have already, but will, especially in the near future, ability to analyze the audio and video is more than just what they say. It's the intonations, the vacillations. You could even detect certain emotional qualities within the voice, which we're very close to having that, and that's going to actually increase the quality and the inter-rater, all those variables that makes a database more valuable over time. So I would love to know if that's been done.
So again, 80-year study. So in the beginning, no, of course, that wasn't done. But the study did an interesting thing. It was driven by folks who were clinicians, had learned to work with people clinically, and they were really interested in what people had to say. So the notes from interviews are quite extensive, often including verbatim quotes from participants. So when I go back into the study records, I can get a real feel for what this person may have been like as an adolescent from the interview. The notes are often, 10 to 15 pages long from a 45-minute interview. More recently, of course, we've started to record the interviews, both originally just doing audio or digital recordings, and we've also done video recordings of interactions as well. So, and we've used some of the methods that you're suggesting, trying to look at not just the content of what people are saying, but also the way in which they say things and the voice tone and frequency of certain aspects of speech are all things that we have been interested in and continue to look at.
Absolutely. It's an interesting time with the data and the science of large data that's about to hit us, and it's going to give us so much more information. From my own interest, because I'm a behavioral neurologist and interested in cognition, I as a stroke neurologist and behavior as well. Any cognitive testing being done? Okay.
Yeah, so of course, as our participants aged, as they got into their 70s and 80s and even 90s, as we followed them through the end of life, one of the things that we were interested in was their cognitive functioning and trying to look for signs of cognitive decline. So we used some standard neuropsychological batteries, testing their memory and some of their executive functioning. Wow. And one of the things that got us exciting, because we're a study that's become known for seeing the importance of relationships in well-being, but also in physical well-being as well, in our health. So we found a pattern, for example, that participants in their 80s who were strongly connected to their partners, this is their intimate partners, showed less of a decline over a 3.5-year period in their memory functioning. So we're beginning to try and unpack some of the connections to cognitive functioning and cognitive decline as people age as well.
Yeah, that's remarkable. Also, some of the other confounds that we usually look at when we're looking at happiness, although it manifests so differently, is education level, socioeconomic status, nowadays zip codes and things of that nature that can become a big factor, and you kind of alluded to that. So let's get into the content of what you found. Sorry, you wanted to say something?
Well, I wanted to say one thing about education, which is quite fascinating. So we had almost 2/3 of our sample were poor boys growing up in Boston and these, sort of challenging neighborhoods. Most of them didn't go on to college, whereas the Harvard sample, the boys that were in college at that point, obviously were in university, and many of them went on and got additional educational training. But one of the notable findings early on from the study is that there was a gap of about 10 years in terms of how long the two cohorts lived. So the boys that grew up in these inner city neighborhoods on average died 10 years younger than the group that went to Harvard University. So the marker there is education, but we know, of course, in this study and many others, education is much bigger than just going to school and paying attention to your classes. It's a marker for socioeconomic status and certain opportunities like better access to health and things like that. But that's quite a dramatic difference. And one of the things we tried to do more recently, where this is ongoing work that we're doing, is to go into the actual neighborhoods that the boys grew up in and try and see what kinds of influences those neighborhoods may have had. So they grew up in the 20s and 30s. This was a time when public water wasn't accessible at this point, or if it was accessible, it was at a location where you had to go to. It wasn't coming into your house. So we're trying to trace some of the potential health exposures that they had early on by the neighborhoods that they grew up in. Some of them also lived downwind of, manufacturing places that might have been spewing lead out into their neighborhoods. So we're trying to make that connection that you're suggesting between neighborhoods or zip codes and their health outcomes as they live their entire lives.
It's so interesting that you bring, the complexity of the variables that go into creating an outcome, any outcome, not even one as complex as happiness or quality is so varied, and that up to now we've been missing a lot of the confounds, a lot of the variables that could indirectly have a significant effect. So we'll get into that when it comes to a complex concept like this. So you named the book about a good life, right? Even that name, that concept, it intrigues me. How did you come to that? For myself, I would think, what would be the most how I would determine the naming paradigm is it the most encompassing title? Is it the most encompassing variable that would take everything else underneath it? But how would you decide what is the umbrella and what goes under it? Both of those factors are almost like a tautology kind of a thing. So how did you determine that title?
So I think the best way to talk about this is that the question of how to live a good life and what the good life is a topic that I've been focused on since I was an adolescent. I spent a good amount of my time in college, both in classes and with friends, trying to think about it and figure it out. And of course, I tried it in my life itself, trying to figure out the ways to pursue what I thought would lead to happiness and a good life. So we thought the good life encompassed this idea about that we all struggle with, sort of how to live a life that's fulfilling and meaningful. And we decided to name it The Good Life. The study's also been known as the longest study of happiness. And it's true that we've been interested in happiness and thriving. But one of the take-homes that I want to include early in our discussion is the good life is filled with good things and also sad things and challenges. So the good life was a term that allowed us to incorporate the idea that it's hard to live a good life filled with happiness and meaning without also experiencing struggles and loss. And if you think about relationships, which we think is the key to a good life, relationships are the places where we often experience our greatest joys, but it's hard to be in relationships without also experiencing tensions and disappointments and certainly loss as well when we're close to people. So the good life is a life that's well lived because you engage in life, you engage in the good parts, but you also experience some of the challenges that life brings us.
Amazing. Was there an accepted definition? I'm just wondering, how do you apply that definition to a population when you're working with questionnaires? Like what are the variables that go in it?
So it's really interesting how the science has turned out around this, because in social science, when people talk about happiness, they usually talk about two dimensions. So they talk about a kind of more long-standing dimension, which might be, in general, how satisfied you are in your life or the meaning you experience in your life. And that's a relatively stable aspect of your own identity. In general, do you find your life to be a meaningful or satisfying one? And then the other dimension is really the kind of momentary joy and happiness. So it's those positive emotions that we link with happiness and with the experience of a good life. And those are momentary. They happen in the moment. We can measure them, hourly, or depending with new technology, we can measure them more frequently than that. But the combination of experiencing joy and happiness and pleasure, along with a sense of meaning and purpose, I think, are the two dimensions. And those are the dimensions that philosophers have talked about for, millennia. This was something in Greek philosophy that folks talked about. So the modern definition of what we mean by happiness is not that different than what folks have been talking about 2,000-3,000 years ago.
I'm going to kind of take a risk here. I hope as a good scientist, we're always very careful and the true nature of humility is in science, which is, even though this is my field, behavior, neuroscience, but I'm always very questioning my own questioning. So I'll come at it very carefully. So from my perspective, that feeling of a good life is abatement or diminution of an underlying angst state, which is this sympathetic drive being replaced by, and even those concepts have been so overused in social media that it kind of makes me nauseated thinking about it. Sympathetic, parasympathetic, dopamine, serotonin, it's just bewilderingly overused. But lowering the sympathetic drive and the angst state and create a moment of comfort, and at the same time bringing the signal of awareness to the moment. A little bit of a physiological definition that I've come up with. And I'm very humbly, I'm positing and testing and thinking about it. And I'm not even talking about the blissful moments that, Joseph Campbell had, like riding. I always tell my wife, I'm riding the bicycle on this beach. I think the only 3 major blissful moments was on the bike path. But those are exceptions, right? Those are out of the ordinary. So in a physiological way, is that kind of come close to what you're describing? Or am I so off that I should?
No. I think it's a really thoughtful perspective. And we all have an idea, because that's part of our kind of popular culture now, about the importance of living in the moment. And the idea of living in the moment is that we're not aspiring for something different than the moment we're in. That's the important idea. We're not trying to compare this moment to something that may happen in the future. When I succeed, I'll earn this much money, or something that happened in the past. I'm not feeling the same as I did when I was younger. That takes us out of the moment. So I think this idea about conquering some of the angst or stress or anxiety that we all feel, being able to manage that at a level that we can appreciate what's happening to us in the moment, and those periods in which we feel that bliss or that joy, I think they're probably less rare than you're suggesting. I would argue that they're less rare than you're suggesting. That we can experience them when we're with people that we are fond of, that we care about, that we're connected with. If we pay attention to that connection, we're likely to experience more of those moments. But I like the idea of having to manage some of the challenge emotions and some of the challenge stress that we experience in order to leave us open us to the experience of sort of joy and pleasure. The other thing I like about that definition is, so I suggested it's maybe more common than you were suggesting, but I don't think we at all want to indicate that this is something that we experience all the time, that life is full of, again, of challenges and joys. There's a balance of that. Pursuing bliss in and of itself is not likely, we think, to lead to a good life. There are other ways to pursue this and to lead a good life.
Yeah. Now I have to think about why I'm experiencing bliss so infrequently, but I'm feeling a lot of joy.
You're being judgmental.
I'm feeling guilty right now. No.
Well, maybe you have a high standard. That may be part of it, right?
Yes. And what I meant by bliss was this moment. I don't mean any out of body experience kind of a thing, but really an exalted, higher level of experience. But experiencing high level joy is definitely something. Now I'm being defensive. Dr. Schulz, I am happy. I promise you.
Good.
No, but that's beautiful. So, having said that, without putting out the final product, what did you find in general? And I would love to kind of disentangle this amazing 80-year story.
I'm curious to know that too.
Right. So when you do a study for 80 years, there are hundreds and hundreds of findings. But when we zoom out a little bit and we kind of look at the signal here, that's the most common predictor. What we found is it's relationships that shape your health and your psychological well-being. It's the best predictor in our study, and in fact, in many studies. So one of the things that's really important when you do science, and both of you do such a good job of this in your work, is to look beyond one study. So our study is interesting. It's one of the only studies to follow people for that length of time and with the focus that we have. But it's also a unique study. It's a group of people that were born in the 30s. Initially, the sample was all boys or men. So it's really important to look beyond one study to look at whether the signal that's coming from this study is similar to the signal that you're getting from other studies. It's what we call replication, of course. So when we look across studies, It's extraordinary, the amount of research now that finds the importance of human connection for both positive well-being and the absence of connection, what we now call loneliness, as a risk factor for physical health and for early or premature death. So the things that we were finding in our study, and I'm happy to talk about more details, have been confirmed by other studies, is the exciting part.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah. And so the relationships.
And before we move forward, I want our audience to understand that, because a lot of people have questions like, okay, maybe it was something else. Maybe there are other factors that are imposing on a person's understanding of their life. Maybe it's their education level. Maybe they never really experienced, say, things that would challenge their socioeconomic status levels or hunger or health issues. But in a scientific study, most of these factors are accounted for. So, all of these factors are adjusted for. And so that's the finding. I just wanted to kind of introduce that topic because it is a scientific study at the end of the day, and all of these factors are adjusted for. Correct, Dr. Schulz?
Exactly. And I'll give you just one example of one of our findings, but again, there are many that point to the importance of relationships. So if we look at midlife in their 50s, at what predicts a healthy kind of period in their 80s. We looked at folks again in their 80s, and we looked at if they were still alive, if they were alive, how well they were functioning physically, and if they were happy. And the folks who were doing the best in their 80s, it wasn't their cholesterol level that predicted their health in their 80s. It was the quality of their relationships, in this case with their partner. So their intimate partner predicted that. I already talked about this finding where the connection that one has in their 80s to one's partner help predict cognitive health 3.5 years later. So all of these findings are controlling very carefully, as Aisha suggests, for other factors like socioeconomic status and physical health. When we're looking at cognitive health, we look very carefully trying to isolate these factors, but equally important, they're replicated. These are findings that are common in other studies when we look and we gather the data. If you look at meta-analyses that integrate hundreds of studies now, we find the power of relationships in shaping physical health.
Amazing.
Incredible. The variable that kind of intrigued me, because the two of us work, it's almost like continuous work from morning till night on the same topic, which is neuro. What were the elements as far as relationship was concerned as that determined the cognitive resiliency over time?
Yeah. So I want to say one thing for your listeners, that when I talk about relationships, I'm talking about a variety of relationships. So we're talking about intimate relationships, friendships, relationships with your relatives, with your kids, with your parents, that the finding isn't restricted to one type of relationship. When we kind of unpack it, what becomes clear is that relationships give us so many things. They serve so many functions that it's hard to get that from one relationship. But the finding that I was talking about in terms of cognitive health is about an intimate relationship. So what we did is we interviewed folks in their 80s. This is one of those times that we recorded the interview. And we asked them a little bit about their relationship with their partner, and particularly how much they were able to depend on their partner for assistance, or how much they seemed to fear that, how much they were thinking about their own physical decline and their ability to provide and help their partner. So these are folks in their 80s. And we came up with a rating of security of attachment. So attachment is an idea that begins with early infancy, about how much a child can depend on a caretaker for safety and security. A secure base is the language that folks in attachment use. And we had an idea, but it hadn't been studied, that in your 80s, it's really beneficial to have a secure base too, that with the potential decline in health, the imminent risk perhaps of dying, of losing your partner, that having a secure base again became quite powerful. So we used this interview to assess their security of attachment. And we did it not just by what they told us, but also how believable the story they told us. So we asked them to give us, for example, 5 adjectives that describe their relationship with their partner. And if they said something like loving, we said, could you give us an example of what you mean by loving? And part of what we were looking at as we listened to their narrative unfold was how believable that narrative was. And if they said, you just have to believe me, it's loving, we didn't believe them. We're psychologists, so we didn't believe them. If they give us examples of how they were loving, my partner is always kind. My partner helps me figure out what I need to do during the day, helps me think about what's most important in my life. We said, great, it sounds like that really is a loving relationship. And the security of that relationship predicted how strong people's memory was 3.5 years later. This was more true for women than for men, but this link with cognitive health was quite intriguing. And there's a lot of more recent research trying to understand and unpack the role that connections and social engagement might play with keeping our brains sort of fresh and healthy as we age. So this was a finding that intrigued us. The mechanism isn't exactly clear to us, but the signal was very clear that those who are more strongly attached preserved more of their memory functioning 3.5 years later.
Not to throw a wrench. I'm already thinking as a scientist of the negative confound. For example, if somebody wasn't able to produce a believable story, it might have been signs of early cognitive decline that actually presaged future. But I'm not trying. Yeah,
interesting.
Absolutely. So there are a number. This is again why we always look to other research to replicate the finding and see that there's a signal. But there is other research talking about when we're in connection with others, when we engage regularly. And you have to think about people in their 80s and 90s who may have. They may be more isolated. There may be fewer opportunities to exercise that part of our social brain. That there's something about being in a strong connection that may exercise parts of the brain. We think this is a potential mechanism that's worthy of looking into, that may have some benefits for health. There are all sorts of other mechanisms that could be at work here that have to do with, healthy behaviors of people who are in more secure attachment. The verbal and linguistic patterns that you're talking about, I think, are also important to look at. But an intriguing finding that we're eager to see more people look at.
Just to expand on this concept, we just shared a concept yesterday about environment or the
an enriched environment for cognitive reserve.
Yeah, and there's nothing more enriching than the conversations that you have regularly with your partner. We've seen often partnerships that have been there for 40, 50 years, but there's not much exchange. But that exchange is an incredible, consistent, ever-present signal creating, cognitive reserve creating process, which is probably more powerful than anything else we speak about, which is nutrition and exercise.
So even though sometimes you feel like your brain is being fried with your partner, I'm not talking about you, it's actually a good thing. It's a good thing. Your brain is actually getting a lot of exercise.
I don't know how we should take that, but yes. But yeah.
No, I love
that. I love this idea, though, and that's the mechanism that we have in mind that I think is worthy of looking at some more. So it's the kinds of things that my partner may give me, but also in listening to my partner, I have to exercise my brain in certain ways. I have to try and put myself in her shoes. What is she trying to tell me? Why is this important to her? I have to do things. In good relationships, we do this maybe naturally, or we learn to do it. But I have to do things that require tremendous cognitive activities about perspective taking, and trying to understand things on the fly, right? It's not like reading a book where you can put it down and come back to it later. When you're talking to your partner in real time, there's a cognitive demand that is quite significant. So I love this idea that you're putting forth, and that's the idea that we had in our head too. That might be one of the potential mechanisms that are at play here.
I mean, even soft concepts like respect in a relationship. Respect in a relationship means that you're attending to a higher number of signals, as opposed to just passing them off as noise or and reflex loops, or and in computer science they call it macro or habit thoughts. And when you're having a respect for a relationship, okay, it's great as far as the social structure, but as far as cognitive, that means you have to be in a higher state of awareness, higher signal detection mechanism, and then therefore you have to process it more, which means that your tacit default state is a higher level of cognitive activity. Oh, that's pretty beautiful.
That is really cool. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
See, what your listeners can't hear, that I can see is the body language between the two of you, which I also think is part of it, right? You need to figure out a way to communicate with your partner. It might involve touching. It might involve head nodding. It could involve all sorts of things. that require cognition, that your brain is heavily involved. So
beautiful.
So fascinating.
Speaking of that, so relationships, and of course, it's not a monosyllabic or an all encompassing concept. It varies. Deep relationship, even if you take it even deeper, or define it even more specifically with deep relationships and connected relationship, whatever. If you had to make it into greater strata of good relationship or good life, how would you distill that into those different strata of definitions of good life?
Yeah, so we like to think about the functions that relationships serve and where you're getting them from. So it's clear that relationships are key in helping us deal with stress. So when we're stressed, we have our emotions to deal with, and being connected to other people can help calm us. People who we care about and we trust can call us out and tell us that, you've talked about this for years, Marc, about this feeling. Maybe it's not everyone else. Maybe it's you here. Maybe you need to think more about you. So there are a number of ways that people can help us when we're stressed out. They can give us information that may help identify a path forward. So they may have expertise that we don't have. They might help us, when we need things, drive us to a doctor or drive us to the hospital, or look after our kids if we need them. So stress buffering is a big part of why relationships are probably important for health. But if we start to unpack it, there are hundreds of functions that relationships serve. Our identities are shaped by who we spend time with and who we feel connected to. Identity is important for our mental health. The experience of joy and pleasure, really important. That is part of the good life. We often experience our greatest joys and pleasures with people that we're connected to. So the list goes on, and some people are fortunate. They can find all those functions in one person. It's often an intimate other. But many of us rely on more than one person to fulfill those relationship functions.
Yeah.
I also want to say at some basic human level, we're social animals. So just the feeling of connection, which is sort of the opposite of feeling lonely, the feeling of connection is so important. I think for many of us, we realized it more than ever during the pandemic when we were disconnected from others. But as humans, we need that sense of connection with other folks. And that's part of what relationships give us. Clearly, if we look at our evolutionary past, we were social animals. That was the way we survived. We protected ourselves. We built, safety, and we found food with numbers with other people. So this is a part of our past. And in modern culture, one of the biggest threats to our physical and our mental health is a sense of isolation or loneliness.
So this intrigues me in the sense that, how does concepts, these are old concepts coming from us from Carl Jung and even probably earlier than that, the introvert and the extrovert concept, which now we know it's not just this monosyllabic concept of introvert and extrovert, it's a continuum, and it's also across different behavioral manifestations. But how does that manifest, or how does that represent itself in this environment of community and connectivity?
Yeah. So this, to me, is a really interesting topic because so many people identify with the idea that I'm shy or I'm introverted. And what we find and what other studies find is that everyone needs connection. Everyone benefits from those social connections. For people who are shy or more on the extreme version of introversion, they may also experience stress and anxiety when they connect with others. So they have to manage that side that you were talking about, the arousal side, which can be aversive to them. It can be troubling. It can be worrisome, when you experience anxiety. So for folks who are worried about how they're doing in relationships, worried about what relationships may do to them, relationships have an added, I don't want to say cost is not the right word, but they have an added challenge that they have to overcome in order to enjoy the benefits of relationships. But the message that I want to emphasize is that we all need relationships. Even the most introverted people need relationships. And this in some ways is surprising even to me. When I was younger in my life, I worked on another longitudinal study, and we interviewed people. We were interested in the mental disorders that they may have had, the psychiatric disorders. So we did a structured interview of folks. And one of the things that was amazing to me, this was before I went to graduate school, It was amazing to me that the folks that had anxiety disorders, especially social anxiety disorders, often found jobs in which they didn't spend time with others. So the one that I remember the most was someone who did an overnight shift in a supermarket, stocking the shelves in the supermarket so they wouldn't have to deal with people at night. Yeah. So we know there are people out there that really find being in places that are very social. They feel that aversive in some ways. They worry about what that will be like. But those people also benefit from relationships if they can tolerate some of the anxiety and stress that it creates as well.
That's interesting. We have two teenagers, and I always bring up the concept of making yourself, to some extent, of course, this is not a binary concept. It's just, to some extent, comfortable with discomfort, because that discomfort, you have to move that edge of that discomfort, because that also helps with life, taking on opportunities, taking on challenges, putting yourself in uncomfortable situations of growth. Growth itself, change or delta, is the very essence of our frontal lobe, who we are as humans. But at the same time, though, I have to be very careful that especially my kids, or the people I speak to, I don't make it sound like they have to jump too fast. It has to be a incremental increase in comfort seeking. But what you say here is extremely important. I want everybody to recognize the fact that social interaction is important for our health and our brain health. Wherever you are in that journey of comfort and uncomfortable situations, you're the best person to kind of test out the edge of that and push yourself, because the idea that there are people that are just introverts and should just stay in a room and that's healthy, it's not. It's really, it should be a little more than that.
I think that's absolutely right. And what I think is also important to say is that, we talked about the functions of relationships, and part of that function is to give us joy and pleasure. But for some people, being in a loud room with loud music and lots of people is never going to give them joy. They need a quieter atmosphere, and that's fine. So it's the question of where you find that kind of connection. I think that's really important. I'm a clinician, I'm a clinical psychologist, and I've treated plenty of people with anxiety disorders. And the basic sort of underlying principle of treating anxiety disorders is exactly what you communicated, right? It's graded exposure to the things that you're afraid of. Yeah. But all of us, actually, we talk in our book, The Good Life, we talk about the idea of social fitness. So all of us benefit from attentive and intentional action around our kind of social connection. So what are we good at? What do we need to practice more? What do we need help from a friend or a partner to help us through? How can we improve our social connections? And the idea that somehow we'll be good at things socially without practice, I think, is problematic, that all of us need to work on our social fitness in ways that we can maximize the benefits of social connection.
Absolutely.
I love that phrase, social fitness.
Social fitness, absolutely.
That is so appropriate.
I tell my kids, now we give public talks by the dozens in a week, and it's just they feel like it just came natural to us. And I tell them, even in medical school, if I had to speak in public, I describe to them the physical state that I was going through, so that they know they can see it, they can mirror it, and they know that there's a way out of it. The heart rate, I had to actually clench my thumbs and cause some discomfort, so that would take, and it is a journey. It's a slow journey, but it's a journey that can be that can be had in slow incremental changes. Now, did you see this description of the good life? I'm going to stick with that. Different in different cultures and different populations?
Yeah, such an important question. So again, for the book, we spent a lot of time looking at research from a number of different backgrounds of participants in the studies and from a number of different countries. And the best data that I can talk about really is around loneliness these days. So I'm going to talk about the importance of social connection in the good life. And what we find is across countries, and there are meta-analyses that number now over 200 studies, we find that the absence of connection or the lack of social integration, it can be measured in lots of different ways, is consistently connected to both physical health and risk for morbidity. So really important, risk for mortality, excuse me. So really important idea that seems to be true across culture. There's also a very famous study by House and colleagues that was published in Science years ago that to me is a very important study. It looks at risk for death at any age, and it's from very divergent samples that they studied. So one sample was in Eastern Finland. Finland is an incredibly homogeneous country, all Caucasian. Finland actually has a very complicated heritage, but white as we define it in sort of modern culture. They also looked at a group of people in Georgia that included a number that was mostly blacks and whites in Georgia. And they looked at risk of death at any age. And what you see is that people who grew up in Finland, they have a huge privilege. They're likely to live longer at any age. There's something about growing up in Finland or about their genetic heritage that distinguishes them from other populations, including folks that grew up in Georgia. However, if you look at, you change what you're focusing on your study, if you look at social integration and risk of death at any age, what you find is a positive relationship between, or I should say a negative relationship between the lack of social integration and the risk of dying. That the less socially integrated you are, the higher your risk of dying at any age. And that's true in Eastern Finland, it's true in Georgia, it's true in almost every study that you look at. And the slope, the nature of that relationship is pretty similar. It's a pretty powerful relationship. So to us, that suggests a signal that may transcend some cultural values and some ethnic differences that we have. Now, of course, the meaning of social connection still is likely to vary across cultures. So we have to be thoughtful about that. It may not mean the same thing. It may be your family in one culture may be more critical than friends. But in your culture, if you're able to talk about feeling more socially connected, it appears that that insulates you from some of the risks of dying, which is very powerful.
So that seems to be a common signal across different communities, and I see that as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if I can give one other example from our study, if you remember, the two cohorts in the study grew up in very different circumstances, right? They didn't live geographically, they lived in very close proximity. These were neighborhoods in Boston, but very different circumstances. And they also lived, as we talked about, the kids that grew up in these poor neighborhoods lived on average 10 years less than the folks that went to Harvard University. But if we look at the relationship between social variables like relationship satisfaction or the number of friends that you have and the outcomes that we look at, we see almost the identical relationships across those two cohorts. And that's another sign that at some basic level, social connections transcend some of the cultural differences and some of the bigger differences that we have.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. So I hear a couple of words that could potentially be synonymous. A purposeful life, a meaningful life, a good life. Is there any difference between, say, a good life and a meaningful life?
Yeah, it's a great question. And what I would say is a good life is the bigger idea. So the good life might include a meaningful life or a sense of purpose, right? A sense of purpose keeps us going, gets us out of bed in the morning. Having a life that has meaning is related to a sense of purpose, but a good life is about more than that. To us, a good life is about engaging in the world, taking a chance with connections with others, not shying away from them, leaning into the challenges that we have, not trying to deny them or to kind of ignore them. So a good life is a life that may have meaning and purpose, but it's got more than that. It's about engagement with others in particular. So it's the opportunity to experience those good things that happen in relationships, but also accept and embrace some of the challenges that happen as well. When we love someone deeply, it's likely that we'll experience loss and disappointment as well. Even in close, good relationships, that's true.
I've heard this from you a couple of times. I want to kind of bring it to the surface. A good life includes challenges as well.
Yep.
And is that because of the challenges themselves, which I doubt, but I'm kind of setting the question up, or is it that we need contrast to come to the surface of awareness? Yeah.
So there are probably two ways to answer it. One is the kind of psychological, one may be a kind of philosophical way. So when we study the lives of these, particularly the 724 individuals that we tracked across 8 decades of their lives, stuff happens. The folks that grew up in a relatively more privileged lot, that had a good life, that made lots of money, that were very successful, they're not insulated from challenge. It just happens to us. It's part of life. So everyone in our study experienced adversity. The nature of the adversity might be different depending on how much money or how much privilege you go through life with. But life contains challenge. And I think that's just a truism that our research confirms what philosophers and sort of wise religious elders have talked about forever. The challenge is part of life. This idea that it highlights the good stuff, I think, is partly one of the ways that we cope with those challenges. So certainly knowing what it's like not to have something, or knowing what it's like to have the threat of something that's important to you being taken away, makes that thing seem more important. So I think we do see this sort of accumulation of wisdom that people acquire partly through dealing with challenges and dealing with adversity. Of course, it has to be this graded challenge as well. Adversity can overwhelm us and crush us, but if we're fortunate enough to have resources and connections when we encounter adversity, there are often ways that we can grow. And one of those may be a kind of perspective that I would call a kind of wisdom, that life can be different than it is right now. One of the things we talk a lot about in the book are the social messages that we get about the good life. So that conversation is very different than the one we've had, right? The social messages are fame is really important, monetary success is critical, achievement is critical. And that's very different than, the kind of wisdom traditions have been telling us for years about the importance of connection and meaning in our life. So our research suggests that, earning another whatever amount of money it is that you hope to earn isn't going to insulate you from most of life's challenges. The fact is, and it's a sad, kind of pessimistic view, the fact is we live a limited lifespan. We're going to die. The people that we care about also live that limited lifespan, and things happen to us that are sad and challenging. So one of the goals in to live a good life is really being able to meet those challenges, to recognize that challenges give us the opportunity to grow and to learn new things. But challenges are an inevitable part of our life.
Fantastic. This next question I have, sorry, I'm kind of, this is the subject that interests me quite a bit. So today I'm speaking a little more. Is the idea of change or our capacity to change. But before that, I want to speak about the language that occupies the halls of our mind. That also matters. That's actually from another Harvard study. The language that we translate through, the language that we transcribe through, it matters quite a bit. And part of that, in the old tradition, that was kind of given to us, whether it was through the church, through religious organizations, through our family tradition and all of that, which kind of mitigated the negative because you had the totality of connection to the greater purpose, the greater community element. Yep. But in today's world, where we're all TikTok driven, 30 seconds, 60 seconds, where does that language, and I worry about that. I'm actually a big fan of TikTok, and that's a completely separate talk. But yeah, it's about information dissemination, good or bad. But it's about where does that language that occupy our brain come from, and what can we do about it? Because to me, it's very important.
Yeah, I think this is a profound question, big question. And what I would say is that I'm going to enlarge it beyond TikTok, that, the technologies that we have at our disposal today, especially in terms of social media and the kind of virtual connections, can be an extraordinary, powerful, and healthy tool. They kept us connected during the pandemic. They allow people who live in places where they feel quite isolated or feel very different than the people that live geographically close to connect with people that are like them but further away. So there's an incredible healthy power to these new technologies, but they also come with challenges. And part of the challenge is that they're voices that are almost ubiquitous in the heads, particularly of young people. The amount of time people are spending on screens in the United States is extraordinary. I think on average, it's about 11 hours a day. And that means many, many messages coming at people that weren't as accessible 20, 30 years ago when people were relying only on TV or only on newspapers and on their families, of course. So I think that presents all sorts of challenges, and you're talking about both the messages that come from those traditional sources, and I think also the source of connection that provided as well. And these technologies have put up obstacles to some of those connections. So families feel fractured because it's not just the kids, the parents are often on the phone and distracted as well, that they're not able to put away these distractions in the modern world. They're pushed at us at a rate that's quite unusual. So this is something I do think about. It's something that we're researching with the current, so we're studying the kids of the original study participants, 1,300 daughters and sons. And one of the things we're interested in is sort of where they came of age on the digital divide and how that influences their interactions with others. So I'm going to make this concrete by thinking about what the pandemic may have done for young people over the last 3 years. Virtual schooling, incredibly important in some ways. It maintains some connections, but also a huge cost to have all of your connections virtual. That in the world, if we want to have intimate connections, if we want to solve in real time a challenge that we have with a friend, texting is very difficult as a medium to do that and doesn't involve the same kinds of in real time regulation of emotions, regulation of our cognition, the challenges that are involved in real time relationships. And we have a generation of people that grew up both with this social media and technology uses that encourage virtual connections and who lacked a lot of social connections during the pandemic. Those are folks that are coming into college. I'm a university teacher. I see these students not knowing what to do. At the beginning of class, do I talk to someone or do I look at my phone? Do I stare at my notebook, right? We're just out of practice, all of us. And, my contemporaries have the same challenges when we're trying to figure out, is it okay to be together now? What does that mean, be together? Do we get to hug people that we care about still, or do we still need to be careful? So the pandemic combined with this sort of revolutionary change in technology and social media, really interesting questions that I think social scientists need to pay attention to about what impact it has. And I'm particularly worried about what impact it has with our real-time ability to deal with conflict, to deal with emotions that get raised when we have differences with others, both in intimate connections and in differences that come up with people that we're not particularly close to, but it's important to get along with.
Amazing.
Wonderful.
And I think, thanks to the study, which is an ongoing study, I think we will learn so much more. And I'm pretty sure that the data is being collected as we speak. I mean, it is continuing, and hopefully pre-pandemic and a post-pandemic data collection and comparison, bringing in newer generation and comparing them to how they assimilate information, how they, relate to others compared to people in the 1930s. So it's fantastic. If you could give us an idea of what the next steps are for the Harvard study, that would be great.
Yeah, so I think we're really kind of doubling down on social connection and trying to understand it. And this idea that I just talked about when people grew up, were they familiar during their growing up period with social media? Was that part of the way that they communicated with friends or not? So we have in this second generation, we have folks that were born similar in age to me. They didn't grow up with cell phones. They didn't grow up with the internet and social media. And then we have folks who are younger and grew up with these kinds of tools. And we're interested particularly in some of their more intimate connections with friends, with family members, how they engage socially and how they deal with emotions in that context, whether there's a kind of long-term impact of that. So we've also done some research recently in which we looked at the power of virtual interactions. And one of the things we found, maybe not surprising to most people, is that in-person interactions there's more heat, there are stronger emotions that are aroused in real-time in-person interactions than in texting interactions, telephone interactions, or even video-mediated interactions. And that emotion isn't going to go away, right? We that's a part of who we are as humans. So we're really interested in trying to look more closely at the methods that people are using to deal with those emotions, to regulate those emotions, and whether they're connected to the amount of time that they spend in the virtual world, and whether they grew up before or after the virtual world became such an important part of our life. That's a big question that we're interested in.
Beautiful.
Wow.
Beautiful. Well, this is truly, I really truly mean this. I could speak with you about this concept for hours. and all the different nuances. And we'll definitely, hopefully, get to talk to you again about different elements of this. I want everybody to go get the book, The Good Life. I think it's such an important concept. It's science-based. It's not another fluff piece that people are writing from their opinions and then putting some references around. It's the longest study on human flourishing, and I love the way that you approach it. I think it's such an important concept for people to kind of get a little more in-depth idea about. So we love it.
Absolutely. So The Good Life is going to be published or come out in January 10th of next year. So it's right around the corner. And Dr. Schulz, where can people find out more about you? Is there any way they can learn more about your work?
Sure. We have a website for the book, thegoodlifebook.com. There's also a website for the Harvard Study of Adult Development. They can learn a little bit more about the research. And they'll find me on my academic website as well.
Amazing. And
so not TikTok.
I'm not personally a big TikTok person, but yeah,
I was joking.
Not yet, at least.
That was my social interaction awkward joke. Dad, as my kids call it, dad joke. Yeah.
We'll put all of this information in the podcast notes. I can't tell you how lovely this conversation was, Dr. Schulz. Thank you for all your research, your work, for letting us glimpse into, human psychology and interaction and identifying important elements for us to live a truly good life.
Oh, thank you both. It was a pleasure being here. And thank you for your good work, thinking about also how to promote healthy lives. So you guys do good work.
Thank you so much. We look forward to speaking with you again, hopefully soon.
Great.